Hebrew has been considered the original language by Christians and Jews alike. This view, which in the case of the Jews is already attested before the beginning of our era, for the Christians of course somewhat later, survived right into the 19th century. A similar view was held by at least some Muslims with respect to Arabic, the language of the Quran, and therefore of Allah himself. This in spite of the fact that the composition of the Quran can be dated very precisely in historical and relatively recent times. In India, the followers of the Vedic tradition have always kept Sanskrit, the language of the Veda, in high regard. Sanskrit is the only correct language, other languages being incorrect. Patanjali's Vyakaramahibhaka, 150 BCE, in its first chapter called Paspasanika, distinguishes clearly between correct and incorrect words, pointing out that many incorrect words correspond to each correct word. Besides correct ga, there are many incorrect synonyms, gavyen, goyen, gata, kapadalika, etc. There are various reasons for using correct words only, the most important being that this produces virtue dharma and benefit abhyudaya. Correct words are in fact used in many texts and regions. Patanjali mentions the earth with its 7 continents and the 3 worlds, which shows that for him Sanskrit is the language of the universe. Sanskrit is also eternal. The reasons adduced to prove this may seem primitive to us, but they leave no doubt as to Patanjali's convictions. Someone who needs a pot, he points out, goes to a potter and has one made. Someone who needs words, on the other hand, does not go to a grammarian to have them made. Some later authors refer to Sanskrit as the language of the gods Devyanvik. Among them is Bhartrahari Vakipadhyaya 182, who adds that this divine language has been corrupted by incompetent speakers. The Masakas and others, too, claim without hesitation that the Vedic texts, and therefore also their language, are eternal. I limit myself here to a quotation from Kumarala Basilokavartika, which states, "For us the word cow is eternal, and people have an idea of the cow from such vulgar deformations of it as gavyen, etc. only when it follows the original correct word go. And such comprehension is due to the incapability of the speaker to utter the original correct form of the word. The example is the same as the one given by Patanjali, but Kumarala adds a dimension which we do not find in the Mahabharata. The original word is go, and gavyan is nothing more than a corruption of it." Helaraja, commenting on Vakipadhyaya March 3, 2030, is even more explicit when he states that in an earlier era Purokap language was free from corruptions. He follows here the ancient Vriti on Vakipadhyaya 1.182. The much later author Inabhata, interestingly, holds the view that not only Sanskrit, but also other languages like that of the Avanas were created by God in the beginning. Brahmanism continued to use the language of its sacred texts. The same is true of Theravada Buddhism, whose sacred language, at present known by the name Pali, is called Magadhyan by the Buddhists themselves. Magadhyan, we read in Buddha Osa's Vijayamagga, is the original language Malabhasa of all living beings, the natural form of expression Sabhavaniruti. The Samohavinodin Yen, commentary to the Vibhaga of the Abhidharmapyaka, ascribes the following opinion to a monk called Tisadatta: suppose the mother is a daimyo yen, the father an andaka. Their newly born child, if it hears first the speech of the mother, it will speak the language of the Damoas. If it hears first the speech of the father, it will speak the language of the Andakas. But if it doesn't hear the speech of either of them, it will speak the language of the Magadhas. Also, someone who is born in a big jungle, devoid of villages, where no one else speaks, he too will by his own nature start to produce words and speak this same language of the Magadhas. In hell, among the animals, in the realm of ghosts, in the world of men and in the world of gods, everywhere this same language of the Magadhas is preponderant. The remaining 18 languages Owa, Kirata, Andaka, Yonika, Damoa, etc., undergo change in these realms. Only this language of the Magadhas, rightly called language of Brahma and Aryan language, does not change. The Mohavikadan Yen, which dates from the 12th, 13th century, goes to the extent of stating that all other languages are derived from Magad Yen. That is, Magad Yen was first predominant in the hells and in the world of men and that of the gods. And afterwards the regional languages such as Andaka, Yonika, Damoa, etc., as well as the 18 great languages, Sanskrit, etc., arose out of it. The Theravada Buddhists considered Magad Yen, that is Pali, the original language of all living beings. Not surprisingly, the Jains reserved this privilege for the language of their sacred texts, viz. Ardhamagad Yen. This position finds already expression in the Ardhamagad Yen canon. The Alpapatic etc. states, with a voice that extends over a yojana, Lord Mahavendra speaks in the Ardhamagad Yen language, a speech which is in accordance with all languages. That Ardhamagad Yen language changes into the own language of all those, both Arias and non-Arias. The Vyahapati adds that the gods speak Ardhamagad Yen. We find the same position repeated in a work by a Jain author of the 11th century, Namasadhu. Interestingly, Namasadhu writes in Sanskrit, no longer in Prakrit. His commentary on Rudra's Kavyalakara contains the following explanation of the word prakrita. Prakrita, the natural function of language, common to all men of this world and not beautified by the rules of grammar etc. This is the basis prakriti. That which is in this basis, or that basis itself is called prakrita. Alternatively, prakrita is prakrita, what has been made before on the basis of the statement. It has been established in the Jain canon Ravakana, lit words of the Res that Ardhamagad Yen is the speech of the gods and other statements. Prakrit is said to be a language easy to understand for children and women, the origin of all languages. Like the water released by a cloud, it has but one form, yet, once differences have entered because of the difference between regions and because of beautification, it acquires the later distinctions between Sanskrit and the other languages. This is why the author of our treatise, that is Rudrak, has mentioned Prakrit at the beginning, and after that Sanskrit etc. We see that Namasadhu goes to the extent of considering Ardhamagad Yen the predecessor of Sanskrit, from which the latter has been derived. It is also clear from this passage that Namasadhu, who wrote in Sanskrit, took this idea from his sacred texts, which themselves were still composed in Ardhamagad Yen. We have seen that both the Theravada Buddhists and the Jains believed that the language of their sacred texts was the original language of all living beings. Both went to the extent of claiming that also Sanskrit had descended from their respective original languages. This is not particularly surprising in the case of the Theravadins, who went on using their original language. The Jains, on the other hand, shifted to Sanskrit. Potentially this was very embarrassing for them. For by doing so they abandoned their original language, in order to turn to the very language which the rival Brahmins claimed to be original and eternal. The example of Namasadhu shows that the later Jains based their conviction on statements dating from the time when Ardhamagad Yen was still in use. This is of interest, because the Jains who used Sanskrit were in a position closely similar to that of those Buddhists who used Sanskrit but whose sacred texts were, at least partly, in hybrid Sanskrit. A crucial difference, however, is that, to my knowledge, no hybrid Sanskrit text claims to be composed in the original language of all living beings. Before we consider the question how the Buddhists explained the use of hybrid Sanskrit in their sacred texts, we must return once more to the language of the Veda. I stated earlier that the Brahmins continued to use the language of the Veda, but this is of course not completely true. Vedic differs in various respects from the classical language, and indeed much of Vedic literature did not fail to become unintelligible even to speakers of Sanskrit. This problem was already acute in the time of Yaska, one of the aims of whose Nirukta is precisely to find the meaning of unknown Vedic words. We also know that already Pani, who may antedate Yaska, gives an incomplete analysis of the Vedic verb. Both the Vedic Brahmins and the Buddhists whose sacred texts were in hybrid Sanskrit found themselves therefore in closely similar situations. Both of them used classical Sanskrit, whereas their sacred texts had been preserved in languages that, though related to classical Sanskrit, were in many respects clearly different from it. The Vedic Brahmins solved this problem by denying its existence. This is particularly clear from the well-known refutation of Kotsa in the Nirukta 1:15. Kotsa claimed that the Vedic mantras have no meaning. Among the reasons he adduces, the most important one for our purposes is that they are unintelligible. To illustrate this, Kotsa cites a number of obscure Vedic forms. Yaska's reply is categorical. It is no deficiency of the post that a blind man does not see it. The deficiency lies with the man. Vedic is therefore a form of Sanskrit that uses words and verbal forms that are not in common use in classical Sanskrit. That is not, however, the fault of the Vedic language, but rather of the person who is content not to employ those forms. For essentially, the words of Vedic and of classical Sanskrit are identical. A similar discussion occurs in the Myanmasa Sutra and Ayabharabhaya. Here too we are reassured that the sentence meaning in Vedic is no different from classical Sanskrit, and that the meaning is there. Only there is ignorance of it. The repetition of this discussion in the basic work of Myanmasa shows how important it was for Brahmanism to emphasize the continuity, or rather, essential identity between Vedic and classical Sanskrit. Because the two are identical, there is no need to state that one of them is the original, eternal language, and the other a development of the former. In fact, both are original and eternal, because they together constitute one and the same language. This explains how Yaska's Nirukta 2.2 can derive Vedic primary nouns from classical verbal roots, and classical nouns from Vedic roots. The situation of the Vedic Brahmins was in many respects parallel to that of those Buddhists who used Sanskrit but preserved sacred texts in hybrid Sanskrit. And the solution accepted by the Brahmins would do equally well in the case of the Buddhists. They could simply deny that hybrid Sanskrit is a different language, and maintain that it is essentially identical with classical Sanskrit, just like Vedic. There are some indications that this is indeed the solution that was chosen by at least some Buddhists. We consider first one of the surviving Buddhist Sanskrit grammars. A number of such grammars have come down to us. Generally they make no mention of hybrid Sanskrit, and confine themselves to describing the classical language. The only exception appears to be the Kumaralata, called after its author Kumaralata. This grammar is the first Buddhist Sanskrit grammar we know of, and only some fragments of it, found in Turkestan, have survived. Fortunately, these fragments allow us to observe, with Scarf 1977, just as Pani has special rules for Vedic forms, Kumaralata makes allowances for peculiar forms of the Buddhist scriptures that resulted from their transposition into Sanskrit from Middle Indo-Aryan dialects, Bhavati for Bhavayati, Bhati for Bhavayati, and elisions of final I. The name used for these forms is Ara, belonging to the Ris. Pani's grammar uses once January 1, 2016 the word Anara, in the sense of Vedic or non-Vedic, according to the interpretation of the Kausika. Kumaralata's use of Ara suggests therefore that he looked upon hybrid Sanskrit as on a par with Vedic. And just as Vedic is not considered another language than classical Sanskrit by the Brahmins, one might think that Kumaralata looked upon hybrid Sanskrit as essentially the same language as classical Sanskrit. Here, however, we have to be circumspect. The Jains, too, use the term Ara to refer to their sacred language, which is Ardhamagadhyan. But the Jains do not think that Ardhamagadhyan is a form of Sanskrit. In their opinion, it is the source of Sanskrit. All this we have seen. For the position of the Buddhists with regard to hybrid Sanskrit we need, therefore, further evidence. Unfortunately, none of the other surviving Buddhist Sanskrit grammars deal with hybrid Sanskrit, nor indeed with Vedic. It is possible that the Khandra once had an idea dealing with Vedic forms. None of it has, however, been preserved, so that it is not possible to see whether these rules were used to explain hybrid Sanskrit forms. There is, however, a passage in Chandrayenrati's commentary on Oryadeva's Katusataka which can throw further light upon our question. The commentary survives only in Tibetan translation, which has recently been edited, studied and translated into English by Tom J. F. Tillemans. Chandrayenrati cites, under Karika of the Katusataka, a verse which has been preserved in its original form in the Samadhiraya Sutra 9.26 as well as in Chandrayenrati's own Prasanabhata on Melamadhyamaka Karika, where it is cited, too. The verse reads, Navriddhi dharmana asti dharma yaniya astyenati ijadu asti astyanti nastyanti kakalpanavatameva karantanana dukasamyati. This means, in extinction dharmas are without dharmas. Whatever is inexistent in this state does not exist at all. For those who imagine existence and inexistence and practice accordingly, suffering will not cease. Note that this verse is not written in classical Sanskrit. In the Prasanabhata this fact is not so much as hinted at. In his commentary on the Katusataka, on the other hand, Chandrayenrati makes two grammatical remarks in this connection. The first one reads, in translation, here that is, in the words Navriddhi dharmana asti dharma the seventh case ending that is, of the locative does not appear in Navriddhi, in accordance with the cetra, for substitute su, luke, etc. The cetra to which Chandrayenrati refers is, of course, supasaluk purvasaivarakyayahala. This, however, is a Vedic cetra. The preceding rule contains the term Chandasi, and the phenomena described by itself leave no room for doubt as to their Vedic nature. Chandrayenrati apparently feels no hesitation to explain a hybrid Sanskrit form with a Vedic rule of the Adhyayan. Chandrayenrati's second grammatical remark on the same quoted verse confirms this impression. It concerns the singular naasti, where we would expect nasanti. Here Chandrayenrati notes, correctly speaking one would say nasanti tip, renames yod minutes. But in accordance with the rule to the effect that it should be stated that verbal endings t are substituted for other verbal endings, the verse says naasti dharma tip, kos yod min. The rule here invoked can be identified as a line from the Mahabharata on the same Panini Sutra 7.1. This line reads, Tia Kutyo Bhavant Yenti Vaktivim, and concerns, again, Vedic forms. The above passages support the view that at least some Buddhists held the opinion that Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit was not really a different language from classical Sanskrit. We must now consider a passage in Bhartrahari's Vakipadhyaya which may indicate the opposite for certain other Buddhists. We have already had an occasion to refer to verse 1.182 of this text, according to the first half of which the divine language that is, Sanskrit has been corrupted by incompetent speakers. The second half of the verse contrasts this view with another one. The upholders of impermanence, on the other hand, hold the opposite view with regard to this doctrine. The precise meaning of upholders of impermanence anatyadarsan is not specified, but it is at least conceivable that Buddhists are meant. The Buddhists, after all, considered impermanence one of their key doctrines, and used this very term anatya to refer to it. The point of view adopted by these upholders of impermanence is less problematic. They apparently believed that the so-called corrupt language, rather than deriving from Sanskrit, was the source of the latter. This is indeed how the ancient Vritti understands the line, for it explains. The upholders of impermanence, on the other hand, say that prakrit constitutes the collection of correct words, because prakrita means that which is in the basis prakritabhava. but later on a modification has been established which is fixed by men of impaired understanding, by means of accents and other refinements sanskara. The modification here mentioned, which is characterized by accents and other refinements, is, of course, Sanskrit. This passage from the Vritti contains points of similarity with Namasadhu's defense of prakrit studied above. This suggests that the Vritti refers here to Jains rather than to Buddhists. Does this indicate that also the Vakipadhyaya refers here to Jains, and not to Buddhists? Here several points have to be considered. First of all, it is more than likely that the author of the Vritti is different from the author of the verses explained in it. Equally important is the fact that the Vakipadhyaya never uses the word prakrita to refer to a language different from Sanskrit. Bhartrhari does mention the term in this sense in his commentary on the Mahabharata, but they're in the context of some who hold that prakrit words are eternal. The some here referred to can hardly be the upholders of impermanence. Add to this that all the three passages considered from the Mahabharata, from the Vritti and from Namasadhu's commentary mention the same grammatical explanation prakrita equals prakritobhava, and it is tempting to conclude that these three passages, unlike Vakipadhyaya, refer to the same current of thought, probably Jainism. It seems, then, at least possible to maintain that Vakipadhyaya refers to Buddhists who held that their sacred texts were composed in a language which, though appearing corrupt to Orthodox Brahmins, represents in reality the origin of Sanskrit. Since we have no reason to believe that Bhartrhari was acquainted with the Pali tradition and with its belief that this language was identical with Magadhyan, the original language, we are led to the conclusion that he may here refer to Buddhists who believed that some kind of Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit was the original language, which formed the basis of other languages, including Sanskrit. The preceding considerations have made clear that the different religious currents of classical India, which we have considered, all share the belief that their sacred texts were composed in the earliest language, the source of all other languages.